Thank you very much, Dr. Uku, and good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. Mine this afternoon is to take you through this emergent topic of the impacts of COVID-19 on environmental resource base. As we are all aware, COVID-19 struck the world when it was first reported in China in December, and then the first case was reported in Kenya in March. And the impacts have really been quite dire in various sectors. And in this talk, I'll be focusing on how the shock that occurred in the human environment has actually translated into some significant impacts also on the marine environment. Now, when we look at the environmental pressures that we could actually link with the COVID-19. First of all, we realize that the coastal and marine environment is important for livelihood, food and nutrition, income and employment to coastal dwellers. And when you look at the photo that I put on the right-hand side, it shows, if you look at it keenly, you'll see that it captures a number of economic sectors. We have fisheries, which is a critical livelihood or opportunity for the local coastal dwellers. You'll see some boats that are dedicated to coastal tourism, transporting tourists to the various destinations within our marine protected areas. We have maritime transport also confined within the same area. And when we look at all this, we realize that these are very critical activities for us. But when COVID-19 struck, then it came along with the containment measures. And some of the containment measures that we first got were travel restrictions. We had a closure of hotels and restaurants, and a number of others. And this actually resulted into loss of jobs and a drastic reduction in economic growth. Now, when we look at the reduction in economic growth, it was not just in Kenya alone, but it was it actually was so widespread globally. It really messed up the economic performance of most of the countries that we have in the world. And when you look at now the loss of employment that occurred as a result of this COVID-19, it translated again into increased pressure on the marine environmental goods and services. Why did this occur? When you look at Kenya, many people who lost their jobs actually went back to their rural areas and got engaged in those opportunities of last resort, mainly on artisanal fisheries. So all of a sudden, we had many people who had not been involved with the artisanal fisheries now becoming fishermen. And that really increased pressure on the environment. Then we had people who actually started engaging in charcoal burning and all related issues. When you look at this, then you start realizing problems started coming up. Just the next slide. The other thing that happened is we had disruptions in the fish market, as well as the market for other goods that and services from the marine environment, because now things were not happening the same way. And especially the dusk to dawn curfew, the cessation of movement and the closure of hotels and restaurants just closed down anything to do with the market that for the goods that people were supplying. As a result, we had a massive post-harvest losses in terms of the fisheries products. So the fishermen, those who actually went back to the rural and started fishing, went to fishing, but then there was nowhere to sell. So at the end of the day, a lot of fisheries products ended up being thrown away. And it also went along with losses of income. Then the other thing that happened is as people started working from home, then this had implications on the enforcement of the laws and regulations that are in place to guard the environment. Because now people were not there to be able to manage or to implement and enforce the environmental laws and regulations. The third phenomenon that came up is the unplanned disposal of personal protective equipment, which actually led to pollution in the marine environment. And this actually is an area that points to us something that as we start thinking of even the future, then we need to start thinking of mechanisms to deal with shocks, because it means we have, as a country, we have not been fully prepared for some of the shocks that we have not been able to think about, some that planners have not been able to conceptualize early enough. And then finally, you look at the government priorities in terms of investments in various sectors. The budgetary allocations had to change to be able to address the impacts of COVID-19. That then meant having less resources geared towards just managing our environmental issues. And that definitely has some implications, as we'll see later on. Next slide. Now, looking at some of the key lessons that we've learned from this COVID-19 impacts. One, it led to food insecurity, which was reported among so many households, and it heavily affected those who really lost their jobs. We have the orphans, we have the single parents, we have the people with the disabilities, and this became a very difficult moment for them. And as we are all aware, food insecurity definitely makes people irrational. Anybody who is hungry is always considered to be a very irrational person, because you would not tell them to conserve our marine resources or harvest the marine resources in a manner that would be acceptable. They would always try to do it the way they feel better, so that they are able to make a living. So that really became an issue. We had the relief food that was distributed to those that were affected. Then one thing that arose is that relief food was not sufficient, and this led to conflicts. Now, the conflicts that came up is a major issue that we have actually been experiencing even in the past, where we've had different players that try to go for the same space in terms of trying to make a living or to maximize their income coming into loggerheads. In the Kenyan coast, we have had cases where, like in the past, we've had the prawn trawlers fighting with the artisanal fishermen. Now, the relief food distribution rekindled the memories of those conflicts, and people started feeling that they were not really being treated the same way. So as we go along, we'll realize that we'll need to start thinking of how to manage conflicts within the MSP setup. Then we have vulnerability mapping of households. When now the relief food was being distributed, then it was very difficult to decide on which household was really in need than the other. And then that became even more challenging, because it means as long as you have not mapped your households by their various characteristics, it becomes very difficult to come up with interventions that would be able to satisfy people and take people to a different, take the society to a different level or to a much higher level. This becomes even more challenging when we'll be getting to MSP, because again, we have to really know what to put where. Then that means we are really to be able to handle the issues of mapping of resources and putting them appropriately. Next slide. Yeah, now continuing with the key lessons, the disposal of personal protective equipment, which I mentioned earlier, as a major challenge that a pressure that came up. We realized that unless we think of how to manage the disposal of PPEs, then we are likely to still face more problems. And especially with now the current development that we have some PPEs, or most of the PPEs are actually disposable. And as they are disposable, people, the community as a whole, is not well prepared to know how to dispose them. You find people using them, and then they will just throw them in any place. So we need to start thinking as a country of how to do that. Marine environmental conservation initiatives that were affected adversely by the COVID-19, we really need to come up with mechanisms to ensure that we have systems that would be able to withstand serious shocks, even when some social shocks, economic shocks, environmental shocks. COVID-19 was a social shock, but then we may have environmental shocks that may also be able to challenge us. So as a country, we really need to think of how to handle the shocks. There is need to invest in alternative and supplementary livelihoods to build resilience among coastal communities. Because again, as was mentioned earlier by one of the earlier speakers, unless the coastal communities are resilient enough, then you'd find them time and again getting into just the marine environment and exploiting in the best way they know. Sometimes even when the laws are good and the enforcement mechanism is also in place, you would still find people who are hungry doing things their own way. And they would sometimes tell you they would rather die than die fighting to harvest the resources than just to kick off and die of hunger. Then the huge post-harvest losses that were realized in the coast due to the reduction in demand also points to us something that we really need to take care of as we think of how to improve on the situation with respect to the use of the resources that we have from the marine environment. We need to think of the best way to add value to the resources and the products that we harvest from our marine environment. Next slide. What an MSC project process should consider: one, there is need to have an effective pollution abatement mechanism in the MSCP project process to check on non-conventional sources of pollution. Professor Kideka elaborately talked about different land-based sources of pollution. And then we also have the non-conventional sources, like what has just come as a result of the COVID-19 is not one of those that was envisaged. And then some are also likely to come up as we continue growing. It is important to have effective pollution abatement mechanisms just to be able to support the MSP process. There is need for a strong emergency response mechanism so that when some of these shocks arise, one of the shocks that I've been thinking about is a shock like an oil spill occurring in an area where you have mariculture, or occurring in an area where we have marine protected areas, both the conventional as well as the locally managed areas. Now, if that is to happen, how prepared are we? So as we come up with the MSP, we really need to think of how to respond to emergencies. And then the third one here is the need to involve all parties through effective stakeholder engagement for buy-in. Now, one thing which is very unique and is normally ignored is the importance of engaging stakeholders effectively. Quite often, people tend to handle stakeholder engagement as a casual process, where sometimes just a section of stakeholders will be engaged and others may be left out. But then if we want to succeed with a major process like the MSP process, then we really need to establish stakeholder expectations and their interests effectively, do it very exhaustively. And two, we need to determine who would support what area of interventions we are having. We must be very crystal clear on those who would support our interventions. And then also determine those who would be against. Because if we just determine and establish those who would support, then we may ignore those who may be against, and those who may be against may end up pulling us all behind. So it is very, very important for us to know all these people and be able to bring them on board. We'll be able to come up with a strategy of bringing together those who are against with those who are supporting, so that all parties are able to pull together. And then the last slide. There is need to build a strong and resilient economic sectors that can withstand pandemics. This cannot be overemphasized, because as long as our economic sectors are not strong, then we may come up with systems, very beautiful processes, but sometimes the process may not achieve the intended objective. It is important for us to build strong and resilient economic sectors so that our people and our economies are able to support all the activities we are doing. We need to ensure that we undertake vulnerability mapping, not just for the households, but also for the marine environment, so that at least we are able to ensure that only compatible activities are put together, so that the spaces are shared in such a way that all the players would be able to maximize benefits, and the country would be able to maximize benefits. Finally, it is important to ensure that we have effective monitoring and evaluation system, so that as we proceed with the MSP process, all the steps will be backed up with a very clear monitoring indicators, and with a system that would allow us to ensure that we are actually making consistent progress. One of the papers which I published recently in marine policy looked at the effects of monitoring and evaluation system on the implementation of mariculture initiatives. And it came out that if there is no, or if we don't have an effective monitoring and evaluation system, then it doesn't matter how much investment we put in place. The investments will be there, but then at the end of the day, we may not be able to reach our intended destination. The same as really been emphasized also in other fora. So it is important for us as experts in this area to support the MSP process by ensuring that we have an effective monitoring and evaluation system in place. Thank you so much for listening.